Okay, we have the fourth lesson. This is an important one, tone and figurative language. We're going to talk about imagery, analogy, repetition, simile, metaphor, and rhetoric. We talked about some of these previously in the Dickens excerpt, okay, from Great Expectations. We talked a little bit about imagery when we talked about that thick description of the room Pip was in. Talked about analogy, repetitions. We talked about all of these. We'll get into them in a minute. The guided practice for this is the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. It's a great speech. It's going to go in depth on a lot of these kinds of figurative language and a lot of the stuff from lesson 3 as well regarding organization. So I strongly recommend you stick around after this lesson for that guided practice. Okay, so imagery uses description to establish a mental picture. Now, when we were reading that excerpt from Great Expectations, Dickens used a lot of imagery. It's called thick description because there's so much of it to set the stage. Do you remember that room which had the looking glass and the wedding dress and all this stuff lying about and a dimly lit staircase leading down to it and no candle, and then there's wax candles, and then there's all this. It really sets the picture. So you might see in a speech something where they're saying, oh, boys are playing outside. It gives you a picture in your head. Analogy. It explains something in terms of something else. Like in Great Expectations, when we were reading through that, and we saw that Pip explained the appearance of Miss Havisham in terms of those bog mummies, those bodies that he'd seen exposed at the mausoleum outside of a church in a marsh that still had on these fancy dresses, skeletons with fancy dresses. And he went into this whole long analogy comparing her to this particular thing. He made an analogy to try and compare one thing to another to give you a picture of it. Okay, and you might see in a speech or something of that nature, or an informational text, someone explaining something in terms of something else because it's very complicated. Okay, repetition. Repeats the same thing, like in a song. The chorus repeats the same thing over and over, especially nowadays. How can the verbiage, the different words and word choice affect the tone, how the reader feels? Different choices of words can create distinctions in the reader's minds. It can make you think different things about something. So it's very important we pay attention to the words that are picked, that they set the tone. Okay? Very subtle variations can make a difference in tone. Like when we talked about how Pip was very reluctant and anxious. Okay, we get that idea. He's kind of a little bit scared, and we don't quite know why. Whereas if it had just said he was anxious, we might have thought, well, maybe he's an anxious person. Okay? But that particular choice of verbiage, that word choice, can really make an impact on the tone. Okay? And that imagery also helped set the tone. Just like we said, okay, there's wax candles in a room with the blinds closed, and then out of nowhere is a woman that's very old wearing a wedding dress. Okay? Simile. A comparison using like or as. It was hot as hell. It was hot. It was as cold as the North Pole. See how we're using as or like? The bearded man looked like Santa Claus. Okay, those are similes. You're comparing one thing to something else using like or as. A metaphor. It's a comparison without the use of like or as. War is hell. That linebacker was a beast. He's obviously not really a beast because, only humans play football, but you might say something of that nature. An allusion. It's a reference to another text in literature or another form of text. For instance, Ulysses and Cold Mountain, both very famous novels, are sustained allusions. That means the whole book is an allusion to the Odyssey, which is a very famous epic poem. J.B. is an allusion to the book of Job. Jesus makes continued allusions in the New Testament to the book of Isaiah, one of the Old Testament books. He's talking about something else. He's making an allusion to another work of literature. If you're familiar with the book or film Ready Player One, that makes allusions to Back to the Future, a number of other popular 80s films and video games. Wreck-It Ralph, same thing. Makes a lot of allusions to various video games and something of that nature. It references them. It references other texts within itself to convey a certain tone or message. The references, the allusions in Ready Player One help convey this tone of 80s nostalgia. Okay? Here's some rhetorical devices and fallacies. They're helpful, but you don't have to memorize them. Appeal to the crowd. That means you're standing in front of an audience, you're preaching to them, you're preaching to the crowd, trying to get them all riled up. Appeal to authority. That means you appeal to the fact that either a doctor supports this or an expert of some nature. An emotional appeal. You're appealing to people's feelings. You want to make them cry. You want to make them sad. You want to make them happy. You see a lot of this on the stories before American Idol and shows of that nature. That's an emotional appeal. So-and-so has a sad story or a happy story or some memory about their grandfather. That's an emotional appeal. Sophistry is more or less lying. It's one of the schools of rhetoric, but it basically consists of twisting around other people's words. Equivocation is similar to that, but it's kind of blurring the lines between fact and fiction. You're saying, well, it's not this, it's that. If you watch certain politicians in debates, they use this a lot. Ad hominem is straight up insults. If someone makes an argument and you say, you're an idiot, that's ad hominem. A false premise is a fake cause. So, you know how we were talking about cause and effect? You basically make up a cause. Like, you might say something like, why is there global warming? And you might say, because of pancakes. Pancakes cause global warming. That's why you need to stop eating pancakes. Obviously they don't, but that's a false premise. You just make up something. That's a fake cause of something. Okay? It has to do a little more with some classical rhetoric, but I won't get into it. Homonymy. Okay? That sounds like pray and pray, those two words. Someone might say, this is a very dirty and low-down tactic. I would not use this in any of your rhetoric. You sometimes see this in politics, but you really won't see it in most civilized discussion. You may see it with con artists and criminals, but if you said something like, oh yeah, I like to pray with people, and someone said, oh, you like to pray? What do you like to pray on? You like to pray on, children or something of that nature. Obviously, that's not what the person means, but it's taken out of context and says, this thing sounds like something else. Or there was an example years ago there's a West African country that has a name that people were insinuating someone who's just pronouncing the name of this country's major river were saying something derogatory or making a racial slur. And this actually impacts all sorts of things nowadays because they use algorithms. I actually edited the video to delete the original reference to the country because I don't feel like getting flagged by YouTube. Circular reasoning. Okay, that just means you use tautology. And that means you say, it's right because it's right. That makes no sense. But sometimes people will buy that. That's a fallacy, but sometimes people use that. If you want to learn more about these, pick up a copy of the Rhetorica ad Herennium or Cicero. You can get either of those online for free at archive.org. Or Schopenhauer's Art of Controversy is also very interesting. That's mostly rhetorical fallacies, not rhetorical devices. That's more bad arguments, but it's a very interesting book. I'd recommend any of those three, and you should be able to get all three of them for free at archive.org because they're in the public domain. Okay, that's it for this episode. I'll see you next time.